Racist woman insults Kevin Hart on a flight, unaware of who he is. The awkward situation leads the comedian to an unexpected reaction. The stale scent of recycled air mixed with the artificial aroma of expensive perfume. The first-class cabin was a quiet hum of murmured conversations and the soft clinking of champagne glasses. Overhead, the cabin lights cast a dim golden glow, setting a tone of exclusivity. Yet, despite the luxury, Kevin Hart could feel the tension in the air like an electric charge before a storm. It started with a glance, a sharp, scrutinizing look from across the aisle. The woman, mid-50s, blonde hair pulled into a tight chignon, pearls resting delicately on the collar of her pristine white blouse, wrinkled her nose as if an unpleasant odor had invaded her space. Kevin, dressed casually in a designer hoodie and sweatpants, barely acknowledged her. He was used to it. Used to the stares, the assumptions. Then came the shift in her posture. She pulled her Louis Vuitton carry-on closer to her, eyes darting around as if waiting for a flight attendant to intervene. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice laced with irritation. A young stewardess, eager to please, appeared at her side almost instantly. "Yes, ma'am?" The woman gestured toward Kevin with a manicured hand. "I think there's been a mistake. This section is for first-class passengers." The words sliced through the cabin like a blade. The conversation around them stilled. Kevin exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the armrest. He had experienced this before, too many times. But here? Now? The stewardess hesitated, her gaze flickering toward Kevin. "Ma'am, Mr. Hart is a first-class passenger." The woman scoffed, a sharp, humorless laugh. "No, no, no. I mean real first-class passengers." "Not," her eyes raked over him. "You know." Kevin turned his head, locking eyes with her. He wasn't a stranger to racism, to the thinly veiled disgust of people like her, but something about this moment made his chest tighten. Maybe it was the sheer arrogance. Maybe it was the way she didn't even try to hide it. "Ma'am, I assure you, Mr. Hart belongs here," the stewardess repeated, her tone firmer this time. The woman folded her arms. "I'd like to speak to someone in charge. This is unacceptable. People pay good money for these seats." Kevin finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I paid for my seat, just like you did." She snorted. "Please. Don't act like you can afford first class." He let out a dry laugh. If only she knew. If only she had any idea who she was talking to. But Kevin wasn't in the mood to entertain ignorance. He had spent years proving himself, on stages, in movies, in business. Yet here he was, still being reduced to just another black man who didn't belong. The stewardess cleared her throat. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice." "I'll lower my voice when this is fixed," she snapped. "I work hard for what I have. I refuse to share my space with someone who..." "Who what?" Kevin cut in, his voice sharp now. His patience was fraying. She faltered for a second before composing herself. "Who doesn't belong?" A hush fell over the cabin. The tension became suffocating, thick like a storm cloud about to burst. Kevin could feel the heat rising in his veins, but he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of an outburst. Instead, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile that held a secret she wasn't privy to. "Lady, you're making a fool of yourself," he said quietly. She scoffed again, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Kevin leaned back, exhaling deeply, feeling the weight of every similar experience pressing down on him. He could already hear the whispers, the murmurs of judgment from other passengers. Would anyone stand up for him? Would anyone call her out? Probably not. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing the final preparations for takeoff. The stewardess, clearly torn, turned to Kevin. "Mr. Hart, would you like me to?" "I'm good," he interrupted. He wasn't about to be the one moved. Not today. The woman huffed, finally collapsing into her seat, muttering under her breath. Kevin stared ahead, jaw clenched, forcing himself to stay composed. But inside, something deeper stirred. Something old, raw, and aching. This wasn't just about this moment. It was about every time he had been doubted. Every time he had been overlooked. Every time someone assumed he wasn't enough. And yet, despite everything, he knew something she didn't. She had no idea who she had just humiliated. And that, perhaps, was the greatest irony of all. The flight continued, as if nothing had happened. The low hum of the cabin resumed its regular cadence, but the atmosphere had shifted. A subtle tension still hung in the air, thick and unspoken. Kevin Hart, immersed in his own internal thoughts, could feel something within him had changed. He was used to being scrutinized, to the suspicious glances and the veiled condescension, but there was something about this woman that had cut deeper than usual. It wasn't just the disdain in her eyes, or the barely concealed contempt. It was the arrogance, the certainty with which she placed herself above him, without even bothering to see the person they both shared a space with. She was still there, a few seats ahead, arms crossed tightly, muttering complaints under her breath every so often. Kevin could feel the way she shifted in her seat, how she tried to appear unbothered, staring out of the window as if trying to escape the humiliation of realizing that, for everyone in the cabin, she was now the focal point of this whole ordeal. But she didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she just didn't care. The flight attendant, having passed by a few more times, approached Kevin once again, as though checking if he was okay. He gave her a reassuring smile, trying to ease the lingering discomfort. "Are you all right, Mr. Hart?" she asked softly. "I'm good. Don't worry," he replied with a calm tone. "I'm not the problem here." She looked at him with a mix of relief and concern, clearly understanding there was more going on beneath the surface than a simple customer complaint. Meanwhile, the woman, still visibly upset, had begun typing furiously on her phone, probably drafting a complaint to the airline. Kevin didn't know if she would ever realize the full extent of her own ignorance, or if she would just continue to shield herself behind her bubble of privilege and racism. But one thing was certain, this was just another chapter in a long, endless series of confrontations, large and small. The turbulence that had begun shortly after takeoff felt like a reflection of what was happening within the airplane. What could have been a peaceful journey had instead turned into a mental battlefield, a confrontation with everything Kevin had ever faced. He was so accustomed to dealing with the public, with crowds, with criticism of all kinds, but now, sitting in this plane, he found himself reflecting on something much deeper than any joke or comedy routine. The words of the woman still echoed in his mind. She hadn't seen him as a person. She hadn't seen Kevin Hart, the comedian, the businessman, the Hollywood actor. To her, he was just a mistake. A mistake in a space he had no right to occupy. It didn't matter what he had achieved, what he had done, or what he was capable of. To her, he was just another other, a black man who didn't belong. Suddenly, an idea hit him. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms, and looked toward the woman again. She was still focused on her phone, perhaps planning her next move. Kevin knew he couldn't let this moment pass by unnoticed. Not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been on the receiving end of such subtle, insidious intolerance. Taking a deep breath, he stood up. The flight attendant, surprised, looked at him, unsure if he was about to escalate the situation. But Kevin knew what he had to do. He walked toward the woman, moving with quiet determination, until he was standing right next to her. "Do you really think I don't belong here?" Kevin asked calmly, his voice steady but with an edge to it that couldn't be ignored. The woman looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. She stared at him for a moment, before opening her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Kevin could see her processing the situation, trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke, or if she had somehow misheard. Before she could recover, he spoke again, quieter this time, but firm. "I'm Kevin Hart. Maybe you've heard of me." The woman blinked, stunned, as if the realization had just hit her. The color drained from her face for a moment. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. There was nothing she could say to undo what had already transpired. Kevin didn't need to say more. He didn't need to prove anything to her or anyone else in that cabin. He just needed her to understand, even if just for a second, that he wasn't just some random black man who didn't belong in first class. He was Kevin Hart, a man who had fought tooth and nail to get to where he was, who had achieved what she could only dream of. He looked at her for a moment, the embarrassment flickering in her eyes, before turning away with a small, knowing smile. "I paid for my seat, ma'am," he said as he began walking back to his seat. "Just like you did. Just like everyone here." The cabin was silent for a moment, and Kevin could feel the stares of the other passengers, some curious, some sympathetic, but most avoiding eye contact. They were all starting to understand who they had been sitting next to all this time. But Kevin Hart didn't need anyone's validation. He had already won in the only way that truly mattered, by staying true to himself. As he settled back into his seat, the turbulence began to settle as well. The whispers around him started to fade into the background, but inside, Kevin felt a quiet sense of triumph. This wasn't just about this moment. It wasn't about the woman, or her prejudice, or her ignorance. It was about every time he had been questioned, dismissed, or belittled. It was about holding on to his dignity, even when others tried to strip it away. And perhaps the greatest irony of all was that, even though she had tried to humiliate him, she had no idea who she had just insulted. Kevin Hart wasn't just a name, he was a force, and one that would never be silenced. The flight continued its journey across the skies, the hum of the engines serving as a constant reminder of the world outside this cramped cabin. But within, something had shifted. Kevin could feel the subtle weight of eyes on him, the passengers who had witnessed the altercation, some of them exchanging glances, whispering under their breaths. He wasn't sure if they were judging him for how he had handled the situation or if they were silently rooting for him. Either way, he knew they all understood something now. The woman, however, hadn't let go of her frustration. She was still sitting stiffly in her seat, her posture rigid, her face a mix of disbelief and anger. She kept glancing over at Kevin, eyes narrowing as though she were trying to come to terms with the fact that she had just been confronted by someone she hadn't expected. The nerve of him, she must have been thinking. How dare he challenge her like that? Kevin leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms, feeling the weight of all the years he had spent trying to prove himself. The woman's words still stung in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about being judged for the color of his skin, it was the arrogance that came with it, the assumption that someone like him could never belong in the world she occupied. It was that sense of entitlement that people like her carried, as though they were born with a right to take up space that others weren't allowed to. But he wasn't about to let that slide. He glanced at the flight attendants, who were trying to move discreetly through the aisles, avoiding eye contact with the woman and Kevin, knowing that the tension in the air was palpable. They, too, had been witnesses to the scene. Kevin could almost feel their hesitance, their discomfort. After all, they were just doing their job, caught in the crossfire of an uncomfortable situation. The woman, still seething, had begun typing furiously on her phone again. Kevin could see her every motion, the way her fingers flew across the screen, her lips tightening in anger as she typed what was probably a long-winded complaint about the disruption to her luxury flight experience. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't even notice the man beside her glance at her phone, his eyes briefly scanning the screen, catching a few words. "I don't feel safe with someone like him sitting next to me. First class should be for people who belong." The words were like a punch to the gut. Kevin's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel his heartbeat racing, his breath coming a little faster. It wasn't that her words surprised him, it was the casual, venomous tone with which she had written them. She hadn't even bothered to hide her disdain. And worse, she was still doing it, even after everything that had happened. But then, something shifted inside him. A realization. This woman, this ignorant, arrogant woman, had no idea who she was talking to. She had no clue that the man she had humiliated was someone who had fought tooth and nail for everything he had. Someone who had risen from the streets, from adversity, from nothing, to become one of the most successful comedians and actors in the world. She had no idea that the very thing she was trying to diminish was the result of years of sweat, tears, and sacrifice. Kevin could feel the heat rise in his chest, but this time, it wasn't anger. It was something deeper, something that fueled the fire in his belly. He had been knocked down too many times in his life to let someone like her, someone who hadn't earned a fraction of what he had, make him feel small. She was just another obstacle, another person who had failed to see his worth. But this time, he wouldn't let it slide. He wouldn't be the one who walked away from this encounter with his head down. Without thinking, he stood up again. The plane was beginning its descent, and the announcement had been made to fasten seatbelts, but Kevin's focus was fixed on the woman, who was still staring down at her phone, blissfully unaware of what was about to hit her. He moved toward her again, slow and deliberate. The moment his feet hit the aisle, all the other passengers seemed to quiet down, their attention subtly shifting toward him. The woman looked up, startled, her eyes wide in disbelief as he stood before her. She opened her mouth, ready to fire off another insult, but Kevin spoke first, his voice calm but filled with a quiet, controlled fury. "Are you really this ignorant, or are you just doing this for the attention?" Her face flushed a deep red. She opened and closed her mouth, as if trying to find the words to respond, but there was nothing she could say that would undo the damage. Kevin's eyes locked onto hers, unflinching. He didn't care about the apology she might offer. He wasn't interested in hearing how she was sorry or how she didn't mean it. He had been on the receiving end of so many fake apologies, and he wasn't interested in any more. "You don't get to treat people like that," he said firmly, his voice steady. "You don't get to look down on someone because of the way they look, or because you think you're entitled to something just because you've got a few extra zeros in your bank account. You don't get to make people feel like they don't belong in the world they've earned their place in." She recoiled, her eyes darting around, realizing for the first time that the entire cabin was watching. The whispers had started up again, but this time, they weren't about Kevin. They were about her. The shift was palpable. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers, their judgment now focused squarely on her. She stammered, but Kevin wasn't done. "And you," he continued, his tone biting, "you're not some authority on who belongs in first class. You're just a woman with a lot of privilege and not a lot of humility. I've worked my ass off for every inch of this seat, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let someone like you make me feel like I don't belong." Her face had gone completely white now, her composure shattered. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Kevin could see the wheels turning in her head, the realization dawning on her. She had just made an enemy out of someone she had no idea was the one person she should have feared the most. The moment lingered, thick with the tension of the confrontation, before the final twist of fate came. The stewardess approached, eyes wide with anticipation. "Mr. Hart, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Kevin smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm good," he said, then paused, looking directly at the woman. "But maybe you should apologize. Not just to me, but to yourself. for being so quick to judge. The stewardess turned to the woman, who now looked like a deer caught in the headlights, completely exposed in front of everyone. She opened her mouth but faltered, unable to muster the words. Kevin sat back down, satisfied. And as the plane touched down, he couldn't help but smile. The final irony? She still had no idea who he was. She had humiliated herself, and in the process, had just given the world the chance to see exactly who Kevin Hart truly was. The plane had barely touched the ground when the tension that had been building up for the past few hours seemed to dissolve into the heavy air of the cabin. The descent had been smooth, but for Kevin, every minute of the flight had felt like an eternity. He had held his ground, but now, as the wheels hit the runway, he could feel the pressure start to lift, like the release of a knot in his chest. The woman remained silent, her hands tightly gripping the armrests as the plane taxied to its gate. Kevin could sense her discomfort without even looking at her. He knew she was replaying everything in her mind, the words she had spoken, the look on his face when he confronted her. And, deep down, she had to know that she had been publicly embarrassed. The realization must have hit her like a wave, drowning her in the weight of what she had done. But would she ever admit it? Would she ever reflect on her behavior and how it had revealed more about her than about Kevin? As the seatbelt sign turned off and the announcement to deboard echoed over the intercom, Kevin gathered his things. His mind was still processing the encounter, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way things had unfolded. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't made a scene. But his words had cut through the tension like a scalpel, precise and deliberate. In the end, he had maintained his dignity while the woman had been reduced to silence. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a moment of reckoning for someone who had probably never questioned her own privilege. Kevin stood up, slipping his headphones into his pocket and adjusting his hoodie. He moved through the aisle with purpose, his stride steady. He could hear the murmurs around him, the hushed conversations as the other passengers began to leave their seats, some of them likely sharing their own thoughts on what had transpired. He caught snippets of words like crazy, disrespectful, and entitled, but none of it was directed at him. It was the woman who had drawn the attention, who had made herself the subject of their gossip. As Kevin walked past her seat, he gave her a glance, but there was no satisfaction in his eyes, only a calm acknowledgement. She looked up at him, her face flushed with embarrassment, her eyes avoiding his. She didn't even try to speak to him, the words that had once come so easily to her now stuck in her throat. Kevin didn't need her apology, didn't need any form of reconciliation. The truth was, she had already shown who she was, and in doing so, she had only diminished herself. But just as he was about to reach the exit, a voice interrupted him. "Mr. Hart?" It was the stewardess from earlier, the one who had stepped in during the confrontation. She had been standing by the door, waiting for him with a look of anticipation mixed with nervousness. Kevin turned toward her, raising an eyebrow, unsure of what this interaction would bring. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone quieter now, almost hesitant. Kevin could see she was trying to gauge his mood, unsure if he was still angry or if he'd been truly unaffected by the ordeal. He offered her a small smile. "Yeah," he replied, his voice calm. "I'm good. I'm just glad it's over." The stewardess looked relieved, though there was still something in her eyes, something unspoken, a flicker of respect, maybe. Kevin had a feeling she'd seen something in him that she wouldn't forget. It wasn't just about the way he had handled the situation, it was about his restraint, his composure in the face of something so blatantly disrespectful. "Good," she said, nodding. "I'm really sorry you had to go through that. We don't tolerate behavior like that on this airline." Kevin's gaze softened, and he shook his head. "Don't worry about it," he said, his voice genuine. "It's not your fault. You did what you could. It's just, some people don't learn until it's too late." the stewardess gave him a small, understanding nod. She didn't need to say anything more. Kevin wasn't looking for sympathy, but he appreciated the acknowledgement. He had faced moments like this before, but this one felt different. Maybe it was because of how it all unfolded, how the woman's ignorance had been exposed, not just to him, but to everyone around her. As he stepped off the plane, the familiar rush of the airport greeted him. The cold air of the terminal, the sounds of rolling suitcases and announcements echoing over the intercom, it was a strange sense of normalcy that Kevin had grown used to. But today, everything felt different. There was something liberating about the way he had handled the encounter, the way he had stood up for himself without losing his cool. It was almost as if the air around him had shifted, lighter somehow. He made his way to the baggage claim area, thoughts still swirling in his mind. But as he stood there, waiting for his luggage, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Kevin pulled it out, scanning the screen. It was a message from his manager. "Kevin, you're not going to believe this. That woman? She's a major donor to one of the biggest charities in the country. She just posted about what happened on the plane. But here's the twist, she didn't realize you were Kevin Hart. She's claiming that you were rude and unprofessional and disrespectful. You've got to see this." Kevin raised an eyebrow. He tapped on the message and opened the link. His jaw dropped as he read the post. The woman had shared her side of the story on social media, painting herself as a victim, claiming that she was harassed by a man in first class who didn't belong. She had written about the uncomfortable interaction, describing how she felt unsafe and intimidated by his presence. Her words were dripping with self-righteous indignation, and yet, nowhere in the post did she acknowledge the reality of her own behavior. But then, Kevin saw something that made his heart race. In the comments section of her post, dozens of people had begun to respond. And not in the way she had expected. One after another, they were commenting in defense of Kevin. They were calling out her racist behavior, condemning her for trying to manipulate the narrative. It was clear that many had recognized who he was, and now, the tables were turned. Kevin couldn't help but smile. The irony of it all, her trying to portray him as the villain when, in fact, she had only revealed her own prejudices, was almost too much to bear. He quickly typed out a short message to his manager, "Let it play out. Let her dig her own hole. The truth is already out there." As he looked up, the crowd at the baggage claim had grown, but Kevin felt a sense of calm wash over him. The twist? He hadn't just won in the moment. He had won in the end. He had exposed her, and the world would now see her for what she truly was. And he was just getting started. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Kevin. He moved through the airport, collected his luggage, and slipped into a waiting car, but his mind remained fixated on the events of the flight. There was something about the woman's arrogance that lingered with him. The encounter had been unpleasant, sure, but it wasn't the first time he had faced ignorance, nor would it be the last. Yet, something told him this moment felt different, like a tipping point, a moment where the balance of power shifted. By the time he arrived at his hotel, his phone was buzzing nonstop. Messages from his manager, his publicist, his friends, it seemed like the entire world was responding to the incident in one way or another. But the one that caught his eye was a notification from a news outlet. A headline caught his attention. "Racist incident on first-class flight. Who is the real victim?" Kevin clicked on it, intrigued. The article outlined the woman's post about the encounter, the one that painted her as a victim of harassment, but what followed was an unexpected twist. The article quoted several passengers who had witnessed the exchange and, to Kevin's surprise, the narrative had quickly shifted in his favor. It seemed the people who had been on that flight weren't as passive as he'd assumed. They had seen what had happened, and they weren't afraid to speak out. But what really made Kevin smile was the final paragraph. The article mentioned a detail he hadn't even thought about. The woman had been traveling with her husband, who was a well-known figure in the political world. He was described as a donor to various right-wing causes, someone with a significant influence in the media. And suddenly, the whole situation started to make sense. Kevin had experienced racism in all its forms, from the casual microaggressions to more overt acts of hostility. But this felt like something else entirely. The woman wasn't just an ignorant, racist passenger on a plane, she was a symbol of something larger, a manifestation of the systemic inequality that Kevin had fought against his entire life. She wasn't just looking down on him because of the color of his skin. She was part of a world that felt entitled to everything, and Kevin was a reminder to her of how fragile that world really was. His phone buzzed again, but this time it was a text from his best friend, Will. Kevin opened it, knowing Will had probably already seen the media fallout. "Bro, you okay?" "Saw the news. I can't believe that woman's audacity. You good though, right?" Kevin leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day starting to hit him. He quickly typed back, "I'm good. Just processing everything. It's crazy though, right? The way this all turned out." Will's response came quickly, "Crazy, but kinda satisfying too. Everyone's calling her out now. She didn't even realize what she did until it was too late. You've always said, people like that are never prepared for the backlash." Kevin smiled. Will always had a way of simplifying things, cutting through the noise. But this moment felt different. Kevin knew how these situations usually played out. The person on the receiving end of the prejudice would get riled up, shout back, and maybe, just maybe, be heard for a moment. But then the anger would fade, and the system would go back to how it always was, with little to no real change. But this time, Kevin had a feeling that things were about to be different. The social media storm wasn't just about him. It was about a woman who had tried to use her privilege to diminish someone, and in doing so, she had exposed herself to the world. And now, she was the one being torn apart. Kevin watched as the story continued to unfold, his fingers hovering over his phone. The comments on the woman's post were turning ugly for her, and the hashtags #NotYourToken and #FirstClassDoesNotEqualPrivilege began trending. Even her own followers started turning against her. The backlash was swift and powerful. The woman had tried to paint herself as a victim, but in the age of social media, everyone could see through her lies. It was then that Kevin got a call from his publicist. "Kevin, I don't know if you've seen the latest, but this story is picking up steam. There's a lot of attention on the woman, but some of it's turning into something even bigger. I think we might want to make a statement." Kevin leaned back in his chair, feeling a surge of satisfaction. "A statement," he repeated. "What would I even say? She already did the talking for me. People are seeing who she really is." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "True. But here's the twist, this is going to be huge. We've got a chance to frame the narrative here. If you play this right, you could turn this into a moment that reshapes how people think about entitlement, privilege, and race." Kevin was quiet for a moment, processing what his publicist had said. He'd spent his career making people laugh, telling stories, and using his platform to entertain. But he knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about a laugh. This was a moment, a chance to do something that could have a lasting impact. He wasn't just a comedian anymore. He was a voice. "I think I know what I need to do," Kevin said, his voice suddenly steady. "I'll make a statement, but it's not going to be about her. It's going to be about all of us, about everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong, just because of the way they look or who they are." The publicist's voice was filled with approval. "Exactly. You've got a chance to turn this around in a way that could change the conversation." Kevin ended the call, a sense of purpose settling over him. He was done being silent. Done being the one who just accepted the punches and kept moving forward. Now, he was going to use his platform to make sure that people like the woman on the plane, the ones who thought their privilege could shield them from accountability, would have to face the consequences of their actions. But as Kevin set down his phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than he realized. A part of him felt like the universe had just handed him an opportunity that he hadn't been expecting. He had always prided himself on rising above the hate, but now, something bigger was at play. The twist? It wasn't just the woman who had exposed herself, it was everyone watching. Kevin had become the catalyst for something far more powerful than a moment of personal vindication. He was part of a movement, whether he knew it or not. And soon, the world would see just how deep the roots of privilege ran. The backlash had only just begun. The following days were a whirlwind. Kevin's name had gone viral, not just for the confrontation on the plane, but for what came after. News outlets, social media platforms, and even talk shows were buzzing with coverage. He had become the focal point of a discussion that transcended a simple incident. It was about race, privilege, entitlement, and the consequences of unchecked behavior. But Kevin wasn't just a passive observer. He was at the center of it all, steering the ship in a way he had never imagined. The woman, on the other hand, was fading fast. Her social media presence had plummeted, with followers dropping off by the minute. The backlash from the public had been swift and unforgiving. Several brands had publicly severed ties with her, and the charity she had once proudly represented issued a statement distancing themselves from her, condemning her actions. The fallout had been more than she had bargained for. But Kevin, despite being the subject of all this attention, felt oddly detached from the chaos. He wasn't interested in seeing her life implode. In fact, he didn't feel any vindication in watching her suffer. What had struck him more than anything was how quickly people were willing to jump to her defense, even in the face of undeniable proof that she had acted with prejudice. There was something unsettling about it all. Kevin had seen people defend their biases time and again, but this felt different. The world wasn't just defending her, they were defending an idea. The idea that some people were entitled to everything, space, respect, even dignity, simply because of who they were or where they came from. Kevin sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through the latest headlines on his phone. His fingers paused when he saw a familiar name in the comments section of one of the news stories. It was the woman's husband, her wealthy, politically connected husband. His comment was brief but direct. "I don't know who this man thinks he is, but I can promise you, he's not the victim here. We will take this further." Kevin felt his stomach tighten. There it was, the next chapter of this saga. The woman's husband wasn't going to let this go. And if his response was anything to go by, he was ready to escalate things into a full-blown media war. Kevin's first instinct was to let it slide, to ignore it and continue with his life, but a part of him knew that this wasn't just about one woman or her husband, it was about a system that perpetuated the kind of thinking that led to situations like the one he had faced on the plane. And as much as he had wanted to avoid this, he realized it was now his responsibility to make sure that their narrative didn't get the last word. After taking a deep breath, Kevin picked up his phone and sent a message to his manager, "Set up a meeting. It's time to do something more." 2 days later, Kevin was standing before a camera, a single spotlight casting a sharp shadow across his face. He wasn't alone. A team of media professionals and his legal team flanked him, ready to navigate what was about to unfold. He had agreed to do one interview, and one interview only. He wasn't interested in furthering the drama. This was about putting his message out there, about setting the record straight. "Mr. Hart," the interviewer began, "thank you for sitting down with us today. There's been an outpouring of support for you, as well as some very vocal criticism. How are you feeling about everything that's transpired?" Kevin leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. His expression was calm, but his eyes told a different story. He had prepared for this moment, not with anger, but with a deep sense of conviction. I've seen a lot of people online say I should be proud of what happened, that I won, and in some ways, I did, Kevin began. But let me be clear, this isn't about winning or losing. It's about something much deeper. It's about the reality of privilege, the way it shapes people's lives, and the ways we're all complicit in allowing it to persist. The interviewer raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by his response. That's a strong statement, Mr. Hart. Are you saying that the woman who confronted you on the plane, someone who has publicly apologized, isn't the one at fault here? Kevin took a moment before responding, choosing his words carefully. I'm not here to point fingers at one person. The woman on that plane? She isn't the problem. She's just a product of the system. She didn't invent privilege, she inherited it. What I'm talking about is the structure that allows her, and so many others, to think that their discomfort is more important than my humanity. She's not the villain in this story. She's part of a much larger problem. The interviewer was silent for a moment, clearly processing his words. Kevin could feel the weight of his statement settle into the room. This wasn't about justifying his actions or excusing hers, it was about looking at the bigger picture. But what about the backlash from her husband? The interviewer pressed. He's already stated that he plans to take legal action against you for defamation. What do you say to that? Kevin smiled, but there was no humor in it. Let him. I'm not afraid of a lawsuit. What I'm afraid of is a world where people continue to believe that their power and wealth give them the right to treat others as less than. The legal system? That's just another tool of the same system that allowed her to think she could belittle me in the first place. The interviewer hesitated before asking, do you think you'll see any change from this incident? Kevin's eyes softened, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's slow. It's messy. But this is just one step. I'm not asking for sympathy, I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking for people to see the reality, to understand what it means when someone, just by existing, challenges the narrative that some people are more entitled than others. This isn't just about a plane ride. This is about how we see each other every day. As the interview wrapped up, Kevin knew the conversation wasn't over. He had said what needed to be said. The woman's husband could sue him, the media could spin the story however they wanted, but Kevin was ready for whatever came next. And then, just as he was about to leave, the interviewer dropped a final question. Mr. Hart, what if I told you that the woman's husband is one of your biggest fans? That he follows you on social media and has seen your comedy specials? Kevin froze. For the briefest moment, his heart skipped a beat. His mind raced. That's when it clicked. The woman wasn't just another entitled passenger. She hadn't just acted out of privilege, she had acted out of fear. Fear that someone like Kevin Hart was a reminder of the fragility of her world. She didn't know who he was, but in the end, her greatest mistake wasn't in underestimating him. It was underestimating the world he represented. Kevin stood up, a knowing smile creeping across his face. The plot twist? She tried to tear him down, not knowing that the very system she defended was already crumbling. And the best part? She had just helped bring that system to light. The real change, he realized, was already happening, whether she knew it or not.